Hello, children. So this is gonna be a book review, kind of an odd one, but so it's a book. It's a very famous book. Obviously, it's by Leo Tolstoy, possibly the greatest author, writer of all time. At least one of the top three. Being Leo Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Shakespeare. Anyways, so I've never really read much. Just like the thing of reading is just I can't focus. I don't know what the hell's good. So it's called My Confession. If anybody's ever read that book, obviously knows it's a tough book to read. Not because it's like Thus Spake Zarathustra or something, but just more like No Longer Human type of just a tragic story. Basically, it makes it's tough, you know. So I decided to read this mainly because I found myself in a similar position or in a similar state that not Dostoevsky, Tolstoy was in. Not obviously I'm not trying to say I'm nowhere near like the profundity or the brilliance of such a man, but it just like that sort of despair. Been in that for a couple years now, and I thought I should probably read it because that's one of the things people say, just to read people like Charon or you know maybe Kafka or people like that, just because you know or Kierkegaard or something. But I thought maybe it would help, and it's hard to describe because I'm sorry, I'm not even gotten into it. As you may know, like sometimes no amount of no music, no movie, nothing can really it help you escape that when you find yourself in that state. But you know what are you gonna do, right? So I had a little bit of background. I knew it was like a about what the subject matter was. So basically, it's called My Confession or A Confession, so you can understand what it's gonna be. So he starts off by explaining his upbringing. He was sort of from a kind of nobility, but like he's like rich. He wasn't one of the serfs, but he wasn't like nearly as rich. But he wasn't poor basically, right? So yeah, but his religious faith was Russian Orthodoxy. He was baptized and everything, and he went to school. And around when he was a teenager, so this was around the time Nietzsche was talking about the death of God and everything. All that, everything was going around. So just a little bit earlier, but around the same time. So he slowly began to lose faith in that. He became not necessarily an atheist, but more just like he was very well. He saw just the obvious demonisms and defects of the church and religious doctrine itself. He gets into that later on, and I will too. But and he just that rational mind was cutting deep, and when he was young, he was just, I mean, he was a recluse. He was going around pursuing vices and drinking and women and whatnot, everything you can imagine. He just didn't have his life together, and he obviously had a little bit of money, so he would abuse his serfs, not like literally abuse or like extreme, but not like just like like you can imagine the relationship, a rich guy and a serf, stuff like that. And he talks about how he deeply regretted this, and this was like the worst part of his life was his youth being so, he was such a awful person or whatever, and he looks back on that with great content. And he was really worried about being a good person, what he should do, how he should live or how he should act, because he couldn't rely on I guess you could say, the religious doctrine, because he saw all the terrible things in that, and so he couldn't pursue that. So he thought he would work on being perfect, and he had some level of success for about a couple of years, and he was very, he's insanely smart, and he's very capable. He was physically fit, and he went into the army, and he talks about how he killed people, and how that affected him. But he said people would still say he was a good person, even though in his mind he couldn't take that, and and he was very successful in that professional field, I guess you can say. But he sort of he didn't feel the way he thought he should. He wasn't like, oh, everything's going great. It was sort of this inevitable nihilism that just slowly crept his head in. And so he found writing. He thought it was amazing. He found art, and just being an artist essentially, which is a part of writing, right? He thought that was amazing, but that only went for couple years, and then he fell, and he saw just how every artist in that field was trying to leech off of each other. They were not loving and things like that. And so later on, this is a little bit later, when he's essentially top king, the greatest author of his time, and he married. He had a lot of good fortunes, right? He was gifted with a lot of privileges, and he had a brilliant mind. He was socially benevolent. Everybody loved him. He had a loving wife, a bunch of children, but he found himself at a state that he talks about, that he just had this emptiness inside of him, this deep despair, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But he tries to combat this. He tries to make every rational enlightenment reasoning he can find, right? He tries to justify, oh, that you shouldn't be this, or this is the way, and it just doesn't work. What he just finds is, he finds the Buddha, he finds Schopenhauer, he finds Solomon, right? And just to briefly, because these are big deals. So he looks into how the Buddha was, he walked out for a stroll in the with the king's guard and everything, and he saw death and disease and poverty, and and he saw essentially the horrors of the world that we're living, right? And Buddha was just tormented, and he just couldn't figure out how to deal with that. And obviously Buddha, goes on to with the Eightfold Path and everything, but Tolstoy, he didn't have that, right? And he, at this time, he talks about, Schopenhauer, how he says he thought of life as a cruel and evil joke by, being played upon humanity and himself. Thought this was self-evident, but he says, well, even though this was evident to him, that he was too afraid to go out with a gun when he was hunting, because he was too afraid he would commit a suicide, or he wouldn't have a rope in his closet or his house while he was changing, because he thought he'd hang himself. So around this time, he's in an unbearable amount of pain, and he's trying to find anything at all. He could not find faith in God. He could not find faith in rationality, and he was. You can see just how awful of a situation he was in. He gets very involved with the peasantry, and he really loved the peasants and how they lived, how they worked, and so what he does is he desperately tries to emulate the simple and unquestioning faith they had in God, essentially. And he recognized how stupid they truly were, but he didn't care. He just wanted to get out of his despair. He thought that if he could not, but obviously he couldn't do it, as to say, when when you take a bite of the apple, you can never go back to paradise, right? That rational mind, it was always a part of him. He couldn't get rid of it so easily, right? And so he said he was not totally rational, because he says, and human beings are similar that way, because it was, even though it was, evident that life was such a evil joke, what he couldn't find himself to just commit suicide. He didn't do it. Somehow he was still, there's something there that he thought he couldn't do it, and he felt that he needed to keep living, right? Which was which was which he was trying to find what that was. And so he could really see is that the only thing that could be there, that it would be having that, you know all of your faith in God. But his rational mind was just eating him up inside. And he says he basically understood that what the pain he was in, the only could be solved by through putting his all of his despair and everything, to put his faith into one thing, and that would be God. But he tried his best he could to stop his questioning of things like, religious doctrine, committing the crusades and things like that, but he just couldn't do it. And this was just tearing him apart. And he was tormented by the falsehoods of all Christian denominations. So this is from The Will to Power from Nietzsche, and I think I'm going to read this because I think it perfectly shows what Tolstoy was in. It goes, "Nihilism stands at the door, where comes this uncanniest of all guests. Point of departure, it is an error to consider social distress or physiological degeneration, or worse, the corruption of all things, as the cause of nihilism. Ours is the most decent and compassionate age. Distress, whether of the soul, body, or intellect, cannot itself give birth to nihilism, i.e., the radical repugnation of value, meaning, and desirability. Such distress always permits a variety of interpretation. The Christian moral one, that where is nihilism rooted. The end of Christianity, at his own hands, at his own hands of its own morality, which cannot be replaced, which turns against the Christian God. The sense of truthfulness developed highly by Christianity is nauseated by the falseness and mendaciousness of all Christian interpretations of the world and history. Rebound from God is the truth to the fanatical faith, all is false, an act of Buddhism." So that's essentially where Tolstoy is in. Now, skepticism regarding morality is what is decisive. Again, Tolstoy, right there. The end of the moral interpretation of the world, which no longer has any sanction after it is tried to escape into some beyond, leads to nihilism. Everything lacks meaning. The untenability of one interpretation of the world upon which a tremendous amount of energy has been lavished awakens the suspicion that all interpretations of the world are false. So when he lost faith in the Russian Orthodoxy, he did not just lose faith in that system, he lost faith in all of Christian interpretation, all of Islamic, Buddhist, rationalist, scientific, all interpretations of the world become false. That's what he's describing. Buddhistic tendency, yearning for nothing. Indian Buddhism is not the accumulation of early moralistic development. Its nihilism is therefore full of morality that is not overcome. Existence as punishment, existence constructed as error, error thus as punishment, a moral valuation. Philosophical attempts to overcome the moral God, Hegel, pantheism, overcoming popular ideals, the sage, the saint, the poet, the antithesis of true and beautiful and the good. So that's the Platonic, the idea of having faith, of the moral good or whatever. All of it is just, none of it is, you can't have faith in any of that, right? When one thing falls apart on you, not only do you realize that thing has fallen apart, you realize that everything can fall apart. And that's what Tolstoy is finding himself in, and no matter what he tries to do, he just can't seem to find anything in that. And when you're in that state, you have all of the, what would you say, good or positive emotions or activity, however you want to describe it, become meaningless to you, or you become numb to it. I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. However, when those pleasures become numb to you, all you're left with are the negative emotions, despair, anxiety, depression, all those things, right? You need something to fight against that, anything at all. So so that basically sums up what Tolstoy was experiencing, which just shows how genius Nietzsche was, right? So Tolstoy was very, like, it's hard to, unless you just read the whole thing, it's hard to describe just how disturbed he was by each of the Christian denominations, for example. And so he would go up to him, like essentially all of them, right? And he'd ask everybody, every one of them would claim that they were in possession of the truth, but and when he asked why that is, and they would essentially say, we are in possession of the truth and everybody else is wrong, and if everybody else is wrong, they're going to hell, right? And Tolstoy was obviously very distraught by this, and he just saw that every single one of them was just filled with parasites and defects, right? And he looked into other Indian religions. Obviously Buddhism was a big part, because people from the works of people like Schopenhauer, and who previously looked into him, which Tolstoy read and everything. Mohammedanism, or Islam. So this goes on for a few years, and so after all of this, he's in this state for years. So you can imagine how awful this was. He wanted to just escape, obviously get out of this. So he decides to stick to what was already there, the Russian Orthodox faith. And he really tries to, obviously, he's very involved with the peasantry, so he tries to gain just any sort of faith he can, but tries to find any reason for living. But despite it, he can never truly put his whole soul into the church, or Christ. He just, but but slowly he does. He's not in that, he's not as suicidal as he was before. He just slowly just gains a little bit more. He just gains a little bit more faith, a little bit more reason to just keep on fighting. Still, he has this. He has a dream, which I'll get into, but he asked the clergyman about what, the things about, the problems he saw in it, and none of them really help. He does have one priest who does kind of give, but also, like, it's better than the others, but it's not complete. And he gets into that, and there's this one exchange that is really, really, like, heartbreaking, because it shows what position he was in. But so essentially he was in communion, right? And if you don't know what that is, it's I'll just read it, I guess. So it says that he's at the altar, right? And he says, I approached the altar gates, and the priest made me say that I believed that what I said that what I was about to swallow was truly flesh and blood. I felt a pain in my heart. It was not merely a false note, it was a cruel demand made by someone or other who evidently had never known what faith is. I now permit myself to say that it was a cruel demand, but I did not then think so. Only it was the position in which I had been in youth, when I thought all in life was clear. I had indeed come to faith. Apart from faith, I had found nothing, certainly nothing except destruction. Therefore, to throw away that faith was impossible, and I submitted. And I found my soul a feeling which helped me endure it. This was the feeling of self-abandonment and humility. I humbled myself, swallowed that flesh and blood without any blasphemous feeling and with a wish to believe. But the blow had been struck, and knowing what awaited me, I could not go a second time. So that essentially is what his life was like after that. He wasn't just tormented by the suicidal and depression essentially, but he he gets a little better, but obviously he still is in a similar position. And then he has this dream which essentially exemplifies his life afterwards, right? So I saw that I was lying on a bed. I was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. I was lying on my back, but I began to consider how and on what I was lying, a question which has not till occurred to me. And observed my bed. I saw I was lying on planted string supports attached to each side. My feet were resting on it. Once I support by the calves on another, my legs felt uncomfortable. Moving on. Essentially, he's describing, but I'm gonna go into so that my legs. So that my legs hung in air. I made a movement with my whole body to adjust myself, fully convinced that I could do so at once. The movement caused the other supports under me slip and become untangled. I was holding only by the upper part of my back. Not only did it become uncomfortable, but I was even frightened. Then did I only ask myself about something that had not before occurred to me. I asked myself, where am I to be laying on? What am I to be lying on? I began to look fast and all the way looked down which direction my body was hanging and whether I felt I must fall soon. I looked down. I could not believe my eyes. I was not only at a height comparable to the height of the highest towers or mountains, but a height such as I could never have imagined. I was hanging, and whither I was being drawn. My heart contracted. I experienced horror. To look thither was terrible. I looked thither in horror. So he goes on to describe it, and so he essentially says he's holding on to something. From the pillar a loop hung very ingeniously and yet simply, and if one lay in the middle of one's body in that loop and locked up, there could be no question of falling. This was all clear to me, and I was glad and tranquil. It seemed as if someone had said to me, "So that you remember." So that was his life. That's what his relationship with the church and his rational mind. So he wasn't scared of just falling into that despair again. However, he was very much not, in the heavens, or what is to say. Now, so that's essentially what it was. I know I explained it very poorly, but I hope everybody. Well, I don't know if everybody should read it. It's a tough it'll be a tough experience. I just, if you have the emotional maturity, or I think you should read it. It's and especially if you're someone like me who's very much against religious doctrine for obvious reasons. Things like the Catholic Inquisition. 30% of the Catholic Church in modern day are convicted. Well, not convicted. They don't get convicted. And then you have like modern day Saudi Arabia and Islam jihadists and things like that, and committing all kinds of horror shows. But most people can understand why I'd be prejudiced against religious thought, but I suppose I am in that sort of despair, not only for religious thought or whatever, just I have my personal demonisms or whatever, but I'm much more in this situation where he described the amount of pain he felt when he was told to eat the flesh and blood of Christ. The way he felt, I suppose I'm in that, except I have even less of support, I guess. It's as if I'm trapped in a dungeon with a dragon, and dragon will always torment me but never kill me. For some reasons too complicated to get into, at least for now. I'm looking for a sword to fight the dragon, though I'm not naive enough to believe I will ever kill that dragon, and maybe I shouldn't kill that dragon out of fear that even a fiercer dragon may emerge. I just hope I find something, anything at all, to fight against that. As I've said before, I'm too prejudiced to against religious thought and I grew up in the Islamic faith, so you can imagine why that is so. But I formalized that my sword will be something like love. I'm an artist, and I'm a child of romanticism, I guess, rather than the Enlightenment. But I'm afraid I won't ever find that. But I know we all find ourselves in that dungeon, some much deeper than others. But I beg to whoever or whatever, the universe or God or whatever the hell there is, that we, all of us, find that sword that will give us the strength to not escape or kill that dragon, for just to be able to fight. Thank you for listening, but glory to the human race.